Against the advice of my parents, I started working at a bikini coffee stand when I was 17 years old, and continued working there until I was 20. If you're unfamiliar with bikini coffee stands, they are little drive-through espresso stands, usually painted in some neon color, where all the employees wear lingerie or bikinis while they serve coffee. I know this sounds strange, and believe me, it is strange. However, the money was good, and it was fun at the time. Not to mention my parents really couldn't afford to pay for college. There is no loudspeaker where customers place their order. They simply drive up to the stand, order coffee, and make small talk as they oogle you in your skimpy ensemble. Within a matter of months, the boss gave me the busiest shift. The shift began at 4 AM and ended at 9:30 AM. Though the coffee stand was not officially open until 4:30. I had to count the till, grind the espresso beans, fill up the sinks, and take stocks, clean if needed, etc. The coffee stand was situated in the corner of a large parking lot, sharing the enormous empty lot with only one other retailer. This retailer didn't even open until around 10 AM, and so I arrived to the lot when it was completely dark, save for one dim street lamp above the stand, and the other in the far corner of the lot. I pulled up to the stand as I normally did, only this time it was my first shift alone. Normally I worked with one other girl, as the shift would get far too busy for one person. I had a routine with regular customers, as I literally worked every single day, as the boss wouldn't give time off unless requested. While I worked, I would see cars approach the stand, and know immediately which drink to prepare based on my recognition of a regular customer's vehicle. After almost a year on the morning shift, it was rare to see a new vehicle or meet a new customer. My boss was extremely strict about being fast and efficient, and would have us prepare drinks in advance for our regulars whilst they waited in the line of cars. My boss was so strict that for the first 6 months of my working there, he would watch constantly on his camera system and call me on the business phone to scream at me for lack of efficiency. After this, I became so fast at preparing drinks, I decided he guessed he would save money by having me work alone in the very early morning hours. So, like normal, I approached the stand and punched in the access code. I went inside and turned on some music right away to keep myself company. The street lamp directly above the coffee stand had burnt out a few days before, so it was rather dark outside. Coupled with the tinted sliding windows of the coffee stand and the knowledge that I was completely alone, I felt a little creeped out, though not nearly as creeped out and terrified as I would be in a few minutes. Even though the stand was technically open at 4:30, I wouldn't expect my first customer until about 4:45. I usually arrived at 4, but since it was my first shift alone, I came in at 3:30 to give myself enough time to complete all of the opening tasks. My first customer was always Dave. He drove a red sports car and ordered a double cappuccino heavy on the foam. He worked for the local Boeing plant and would brag about his high-ranking job in between awkward remarks about my body. You get used to that sort of thing after a while, but nothing could prepare me for this sort of thing that happened to me on that particular dark morning. Though many of our customers were pervy men like Dave, most of the early morning customers weren't as lecherous as one would expect. They simply needed coffee, and no other businesses were open as early as we. In fact, many of our morning customers were married women in soccer mum vans in desperate need of caffeine. I glanced up at the clock as I counted the money in the till. 3:50 AM. I finished the count and walked from the back of the stand onto the main floor. There were 2 steps separating the back of the stand from the main floor. The back of the stand had no windows and contained a bathroom, large refrigerator, washer and dryer, etc. This is the area that my co-workers and myself would get ready, and joke around where customers couldn't see us. As soon as we walked onto the main floor where customers could see us, uniform was required. Lingerie or bikini as well as heels. That morning I was wearing a matching pink lingerie set with knit stockings. The lingerie fully covered my breasts and buttocks and provided more coverage than a typical bikini that you would see at a beach. I counted all of the syrup bottles. I opened the fridge and took stock inside. I turned on the espresso grinder and robotically poured in a bag of espresso beans. I started filling up the large commercial sink with soapy water, and the music played softly on the stereo. Then I heard it over the noise of the faucet, coffee grinder and the music. I wasn't sure I heard anything at first, so I just ignored it. But then I heard it again. Someone was tapping on the sliding glass window of the stand. I wiped off my wet hands and grabbed my cell phone. 4:15. We weren't open for another 15 minutes. I checked the light switches to make sure I didn't accidentally flip on the open sign. Along with the open sign, the stand was equipped with bright floodlights to illuminate the presence of the stand. Due to the sheer darkness of the morning, I had contemplated turning the floodlights on when I first arrived, but was strictly forbidden from doing so until the stand was open. Without the floodlights on, and through the tinted glass, I could not see who was on the other side. I stood there staring at the window. Maybe it's just Dave, I rationalized to myself. I could hear my heart thumping in my ears. The tapping had definitely grown louder. I picked up the business phone and punched in my boss's number, as he had an extensive camera system complete with night vision, and could see in real time both inside and outside the stand. At the very least, he could tell me who was outside. The phone rang and no answer, so I flipped on the floodlights, walked over to the window, and saw the man, now illuminated by the bright lights. His head was pressed up against the glass, hands cupped around his eyes as he tried to see in. I jumped back. "Hi," he yelled through the glass. "Can I get some coffee?" "We aren't open for another 15 minutes, I'm afraid, and my boss will be mad if I open early." "Oh well, I can wait." The man then walked away from the window and stepped back into a small black Honda. I continued my opening duties, warily eyeing the black Honda. At the time I felt a false sense of security, lulled into the daily routine of my shift. However, this was different. At 4:30 I dutifully turned on the open sign and watched as the man in the black Honda drove up to the window. He was wearing a dark red baseball cap, a thermal shirt, and plaid pajama pants. I opened the sliding window. "Hi, sorry about that. What can I get for you this morning?" I said, trying to sound as normal as possible. The man looked at me for what felt like an eternity. "What I want doesn't appear to be on the menu," he said, not looking up from my crotch. "Okay, so I know what you're thinking. What did I expect working in this profession? Gentlemen?" I brushed his comment aside with a laugh. "We have a great white chocolate mocha." I looked around frantically. Where the hell was the usual morning guy Dave? I silently prayed another customer would pull up behind this guy. He looked away and stared at his steering wheel. "I want you to be my maid." "Excuse me?" I said, not sure if I heard him correctly. "I want you to be my maid. I want you to come over to my house wearing a maid costume with nothing underneath. I want to watch you, and if you don't clean correctly, I'm going to do whatever I want to you." He paused and gripped his steering wheel tightly. "I am not a nice guy." He looked up at me and smiled. Until that point in my life, I had never seen a truly sinister smile before. I slammed the long service window shut, ran to the back of the stand, hyperventilating at this point. I picked up the phone and called my boss repeatedly, with no answer, and I stood on the steps and peered out the window. The black Honda was gone, replaced with the familiar red of Dave's sports car. I never thought I would be happy to see pervy Dave, but here I was rushing to the service window to tell him what happened. I opened the window, all the while frantically relaying the story. Dave just laughed and muttered something about the guy dreaming. He told me I was being paranoid and the guy just had no filter. For some reason, this put me at ease. Dave reached his hand out the window to place a $5 bill in my tip jar. He tipped this amount each morning. "Wow," he exclaimed. "You just opened and your tip jar is already full. I know you make coffee, but it's not that great." "Huh?" I said, slamming the register shut. The tip jar rested on the outside window ledge, so customers could reach it. I had made a habit of leaving it outside in between customers, as it could get very busy. I leaned over and looked into the metal canister. Inside the tip jar was a long white envelope that appeared to be stuffed into its capacity. My stomach turned, as I knew it would be from the guy in the black Honda. "Dave," I said cautiously, "it's from the guy I just told you about. I'm not opening that." Dave sipped his cappuccino and suddenly his goofy demeanor turned serious. "You're right. Let me open it. I have gloves." It was late fall and rather cold. Dave put on his gloves in a dramatic manner, laughed about my paranoia, and proceeded to step out of his car, and he took the envelope out of the tip jar and opened it. "Holy shit," he said, his eyes widening. He held up a stack of $20 bills held together by a rubber band. On the back of the stack was a folded up piece of paper. He unfolded the paper and began reading it. His eyes grew wilder. His hands were shaking ever so slightly. What does it say?" He simply said, "Get dressed and call the police." I snatched the note from him, his jaw slightly agape. The note was laden with spelling errors and looked like it had been written by a child. Oddly, there were rather long words that were attempted but spelt incorrectly. It said some very deranged things. There are some things too sick to mention here, but I will relay the basic message as best I can recall. Some things you just never forget, even if you want to. "You will come to my house. When you arrive, I will examine you thoroughly. And I will tie you to the post, and you will be punished for what you do. Every inch of your body will be bruised and sore. Afterwards, I will untie you and use you in every way possible." Just to mention, he used a different term, but it is extremely graphic and includes the word hogtied. "You can scream, but no one will hear you. This is your first payment. Upon reading this note and taking this money, you have agreed to follow through. If you do not follow through, you are stealing, and you will be punished more severely than if you cooperated to this initial agreement. You will clean every inch of my house. There will be no more mistakes, or more punishment will follow." I got dressed and called the police and my boss, who finally answered. The police arrived, and I went to the station to explain in detail what happened. I handed them the note along with the money for evidence. The female police officer nonchalantly told me I should probably quit my job, that this behavior was to be expected from their customers, and I told them that I had never experienced anything like this before. My boss reviewed the outside videotape footage, and the footage showed the man standing outside the coffee stand, just staring inside. Occasionally it showed him leaning his head into the glass and cupping his hands around his eyes for better view. It also showed him rubbing his crotch. Apparently he'd been standing outside since 3:40, 10 minutes after my initial arrival. At one point, it showed him going back into his car to re-emerge several minutes later and finally tap on the window. I was shocked to realize that the man had watched me for almost a full hour without my knowledge. I felt stupid, but most of all scared. The footage also revealed that the man had his license plate covered with what appeared to be white paper. After reviewing the footage and the note, the police decided the man posed a potential threat, and that his behavior was not normal. They sent an undercover cop back in the stand with me. I was shocked that they wanted me to go right back into work not even 2 hours after the incident. The cop sat outside in an SUV whilst I worked. The plan was this: if the man drove through again, I was to flick the open sign on and off to alert him of the man's presence. I worked serving all of my regular customers, trying my best to pretend nothing happened. I was told not to recall the incident to any one of my co-workers or customers that morning. in case they knew the man and warned him of police involvement. The man did not return that day, but he did return. Little did I know this would be the beginning of a year-long nightmare. The stalking continued for a while, roughly a year. The stalker left endless creepy gifts for me both at work and at my place of residence, all of which he signed off on as Turner. It got to the point where I couldn't prove it was him, because it would often be sent by a courier or a third party. He continued to come to the stand, and at one point he even promised to leave me alone. My co-worker was there, and we actually managed to have a very brief discussion in which he apologized and agreed that his behavior was inappropriate. However, he resumed just days later. The police were of no help, and kept insisting that it would all go away if I just quit my job. I had his license plates, and he was out of state, and vehicle description, but apparently the car wasn't even registered. Despite taking a leave of absence, the stalking continued. I didn't want to quit my job, as this was shortly after the recession. My mum, a sole provider for a family of 5, had lost her job, so I wanted to chip in and help her so that we wouldn't lose the house. Other bikini stands in the area were not hiring, due to being embroiled in prostitution scandals, all of which were heavily covered by the national media. You have no idea how hard it was, and maybe still is, to get a normal job after having worked as a bikini barista. Employers don't like it on your history all that much. The few of the scariest experiences included being assaulted at an ice freezer outside the coffee stand. Thankfully he didn't physically harm me, just grabbed and touched me inappropriately. Turner coming through the drive-thru completely naked and jacking off in a pair of women's underwear. Another incident occurred when my friend gave me a joint a customer had left me on her shift. Crazy it may sound, my regulars often left joints in my tip bar instead of money, as I liked to smoke a lot at the time. I asked my co-worker the customer's name, but she didn't get a chance to ask for it. I was told by my friend/co-worker that he had long hair and looked like a hippie, and this fit the description of a customer who would regularly leave joints in my tip jar. I smoked the joint before I went to sleep one night, only to have a massive freak-out full of hallucinations and hysteria. I thought I saw ghosts, demons and fire, and I ended up in the hospital. I found out in the hospital that, in addition to having marijuana in my system, I also had a bunch of PCP. Later on, Turner would take credit for this joint by sending a text to my phone, letting me know that if I wanted him to smoke me out, that we could get together sometime. I guess he thought that this weed was enjoyable. Of course, I gave his number to the police. I feel like I gave them enough information to get this guy. But I was never taken seriously, or they had bigger fish to fry. They did find out, however, that the phone he used was a burner. In this period of time, it was evident that one of my co-workers was sharing my personal information with Turner in exchange for money, or maybe just because she didn't like me. This co-worker was later arrested on prostitution charges, and I ended up relocating and changing my last name, which is surprisingly easy to do. I did this primarily to get away from Turner, but also so that I could get a fresh start with new employment history, and get away from the negative energy that had encircled my life. I had taken nude photos of myself and my boyfriend at the time, and after we broke up, he had leaked them to everyone on my contacts list, including my co-workers, and of course, this meant Turner most likely got a hold of the photos as well. It may seem strange to you, but after a while the stalking becomes part of your life. It's kind of like living around a bunch of rattlesnakes. You may feel constantly on guard and on edge, but eventually, you work your daily routine around trying your best to avoid the snakes so that you don't get bitten. When it happens, you do your best to move on. I've recently found out, within the last few months, that a man fitting my stalker's description was incarcerated some time ago for doing something even more frightening to another barista in the Pacific Northwest. There was also similar incidences and reports of a man driving through bikini stands naked, or with women's underwear. I suspect this man was most likely Turner. I could not be sure it's the same person, as I never was able to find out this person's true first or last name. But I am hopeful that it's him, and that he will be locked away for a very long time.
This happened several years ago, when I was a naive 19-year-old university student. A bus company had just returned from being on strike, and as a special promotion were letting people ride free for 2 weeks. I saw myself as adventurous and took this as an invitation to go randomly riding all over the city. One of my little adventures was a bit scary. I was at a bus stop in some random, unfamiliar part of the city. A man was next to me. We were the only ones there. I like to be nice to strangers and so engaged in conversation. Things escalated quickly. The man started telling me that he was some sort of crime boss, and that he was aiming to kill a certain person. He said something along the lines of, "I don't like when I have to kill people, but when they cause trouble, sometimes I gotta do what I gotta do." I was afraid he would hurt me if I upset him, so I politely nodded along, as though what he was saying was completely ordinary. Lucky for me, his bus soon arrived. He got on Route 2 to a place called Pleasantville. To this day, I don't know if he was a legitimate gang member or just delusional. I'm not sure what part of the city I was in, nor do I know if he killed his intended target or anybody else. But to this day, I avoid Route 2 to Pleasantville. So like one person before me said, they never thought about their bus driver until someone wrote about it. Well, the same thing happened to me. The thing is that this bus driver wasn't a school driver, rather an inner-city bus driver, if that makes sense. So I was going to math instructions when I was 16, and they were in a different part of town. It would take me an hour by foot to get back to my apartment, so instead I opted for a 15-minute bus ride. I had been taking buses to my math instructor for a few times now, so I knew that the bus I was supposed to take was a 14. However, this particular day, I missed the 14 and got onto 14B. The 14B takes a detour as it is covering a portion of the outside city area. I didn't know that. I wanted to ask him where the bus would be going, but he seemed to be in a rush and just signaled me to climb in and stop asking. There was no one behind me, so I could have easily hopped off, but I was in a bit of a hurry, so I unfortunately got on and sat in the middle. I noticed immediately that the bus didn't take a turn for the city center, but rather for the hills, which I never even knew existed. So the bus is slowly getting empty, and I'm listening to my music, but I noticed the driver's occasional glances in the mirror towards me. We made eye contact a few times. I'm slowly panicking because I've never been to that place before, and I could literally see my whole town from the hilltop. My worst fear at that moment realizes when the last passenger leaves the bus. Now only him and I were left, and he turns around and asks me where I'm headed. I explain to him that I need to get off at the first station in my part of the town, and he grins kind of wickedly. I was panicking, my social anxiety over the roof, and this guy, who is about 40 to 50 years old or so, tells me to go and sit right behind him. I hesitated and he said, "Go on." I somehow scrambled out of my seat and sat behind him, and he started driving again. He kept saying something even as other passengers boarded, but I can't remember what exactly. I only remember him promising me someone would be waiting for me at the station. At that point I say I could exit on a different station, to which he replies with, "I'd rather you leave on that one." He finally gets to my station and I bolt out of it, not looking behind me. I later told the story to my best friend who lives in the area, and she told me he was always like that, and that I should definitely avoid ever getting on that bus again. So creepy old bus driver, let's never meet again. Here is something that happened to me 3 years ago, and sticks with me, especially when I'm out at night. I was on my way back home from a late night gym session. The gym is right next to my campus, but my flat was on the complete other side of the city. so I was definitely making sure that I caught one of the last buses. Otherwise, it was a long, long walk back. I got to the bus stop, and it was empty except for one older guy who looked pretty disheveled and out of it. Already this was setting off alarm bells in my mind, so I stood far away from him and began to wait. The bus tracker said that the next bus wouldn't be here for another 15 minutes. Damn it. Oh well, I put my headphones in and started listening to one of my podcasts to pass the time, so I definitely wasn't making sure that I got caught on the last bus. Otherwise, it was a long, long walk back. It should be noted at this point that I have dwarfism. I'm 4'0" and about 80 pounds, and I'm used to unwanted attention. It was against my better judgment that I was even on this late, by myself in an unfamiliar part of town. I must have let my guard slip because I suddenly felt a hand on my shoulder, and the man was standing right next to me. Too close. I looked up at him and he was saying something to me, so I took my headphones out to hear him. You all right there, pal? I was saying I've never seen one of you before. He was swaying and grinning at me. I'm all right, thanks. What bus are you getting? I did not want to answer that truthfully, but there were only 2 buses left to come that night. I said it was the other one. He looked disappointed. I've always wanted to meet one of you. He stood there and stared at me for what felt like a whole minute. I felt his eyes all over me. Now I think I understand what women mean when they say they felt like a piece of meat. Eventually he said, "Do you have sex?" I've had some inappropriate questions from strangers before, but that took the biscuit. I should have said it was none of his business, but I found myself saying, yes, uncomfortably. He seemed to contemplate that for a while, amused by the idea. What's it like down there? I've always wanted to know. From his tone, he sounded excited. I took a couple steps away from him. This time I was more prepared. That's not really any of your business, is it? I was thinking about how long the walk would be back home. He was getting the bus I needed. I didn't know where the other bus went. Was it worth going through with my lie? I didn't know. I suspected that he would get on the same bus as me regardless. He took another step closer. This was the moment I actually got scared. He saw me step backwards and didn't care. He knew I was uncomfortable and didn't care. That means it's big, he laughed. I bet it does. I've always wanted to have sex with a midget. That was it. I wish I would have said screw off or leave me alone or something, but I was just too scared. I need to go, I blurted and walked as briskly as I could without running. It would take him no effort at all to catch up with me. I pictured him walking behind me with his much longer legs, but I didn't want to look. I walked for a couple minutes before I finally glanced back. He was still at the bus stop, but he had moved about 10 feet to stand at the edge of it. I could only see his silhouette against the light of the bus stop, but I could tell he was watching me. I turned around a corner street just to get out of sight. I walked the full hour and a half home, picturing him following me the whole way. Creeps me out to this day. During university, I had a whole slew of creepy encounters. This has stuck with me the most. It started during my first class. One day a group of us were walking together along campus, and slowly members began branching off. It ended up as just myself and a guy who I was not inclined to befriend. Only knew his name, but I didn't want to be rude and not keep walking along with him. He asked me where I'm going, and I tell him I normally take a nap between classes and was going into my dorm. He asks if he can see my suite. Normally this would be a no-brainer red flag, but my particular building was renowned for being fancy, and others frequently asked to see inside of it. I say sure, not wanting to be mean and thinking this guy will take a quick look around and give the typical jealous comments and then leave. We go inside and I show him the basics, doing so in a way that we ended up back at the entrance of the suite. This whole time he's not saying much. and I'm only announcing things dryly, so I was confident when I said a quick, "It's pretty nice, see you around," that he was going to take to leave. I turned around and went to my room. I did not show him any rooms or say where anyone stayed. A few moments later, as I'm sitting my stuff down, I turn around, and there he is in the doorway. He's silent. I did not say anything because I did not want to invite him in. I wanted him to go. I just look at him, then start picking up stuff and moving it around, trying to look busy. He slowly walks a couple steps into the room and asks, "Have you done the coursework yet?" I told him no. By this time, I assume he is trying to hang out, and tell him again that I'm planning on napping. He doesn't even skip a beat and says, "That's okay. I can watch you sleep and help you with it after." A smile, no tone, then silence again. I immediately tell him he needs to leave and follow him until he's gone out the locking doors, and I know he can't follow me back in. I told a lot of our friends about this, and they were heavily creeped out and made a point not to leave us alone again, ever. We finished the year out, and I haven't thought about this guy in a long time. I did not know anything about him at all, and I still only knew his name. Flash forward a year and some change to the next summer, when I'm taking a bus ride home from a different part of campus. We get to one of the points where the bus stops and waits until a certain time, before it can leave again, and everyone else that had been on the bus gets off at this stop. At this point, the driver starts talking to me, asking a lot of questions. I did not think anything weird at first, and answered what I thought were idle chat questions. So which apartments are you in? And what classes are you taking? Then, as more and more questions just kept coming, I started to feel uneasy with his mannerisms and became extremely vague in my answers. I still don't know if he was always intending to tell me this, but when he stopped peppering me with questions, he began spilling a story of how his son was in my math classes the previous year, and he knew all about me. He then started giving me a lot of family details. It's at this point that I realized his son is the guy who wanted to watch me sleep. All the details fit, but I had to know for sure, so I asked if his son is called Name. He smiles yes. He then mentioned how he would like to start riding bikes with me, and would I ride bikes with him and his son. I was gathering my stuff by this point and had decided to get off the bus. There are 2 doors, one at the front and one halfway, which was closest to me. The door stays open while the bus is at these stops, so people can hop off and on, and the driver normally gets off and takes a break. As I'm getting my stuff and getting up, the halfway door is shut. I look again at the driver, an older man but much larger than my petite frame and build. He is now standing facing me, but the front door is still open. He asks again, "Will you ride bikes with us?" I want off the bus and think the only way is to pacify him. I say yes, and make my way to the front door, not knowing how to get around him. He looks pleased but asks where I'm going. I try and tell him I've decided to walk home, but he still blocks my way and tries to talk me out of it. I'm firm in that I want to walk from here, but he will not move. I'm standing in front of him wishing to move, but my body is frozen in place. Slowly he decides, "Give me your number and then I'll let you go." I really don't want to do this, but I also want off this bus immediately. My first thought is to give a fake, but I'm so glad I didn't as he immediately dialed the number. It was a test. Seeing my phone ring and watching me save his contact, he moves enough that I slide by and make it off the bus. After making it home, I go to block his number and already have multiple missed calls and a voicemail of him just breathing. The situation was reported, and I did not see him on a route for a long time. But around a year later, I was getting on another bus and noticed he was back. I've never covered my face and backed off of public transit faster. Let's never meet again, father or son. I am female. When I was 10 years old, my family relocated from Delaware to South Carolina for my dad's job. We lived near all of our family and had never moved before. One of Dad's selling points about the move was that people in the South are so friendly. I had just finished 5th grade and would be starting 6th in South Carolina. I rode the bus to and from school in Delaware, and so there wasn't a lot of anxiety about riding the bus after we moved. 6th grade started and I was excited about my new school and loved my teacher. Dad was right. People in the South are polite and friendly. Well, most of them are. Anyway, one day in the fall I got off the bus at my stop after school, and a man in a dark green VW Beetle was behind the bus, pulled off the main road, and called out to me as I was walking towards my house. I turned around and probably even smiled at him. I had no real stranger danger fears at that time. I walked up to the driver's side of his car to see what he wanted. I figured he wanted to ask for directions or something, and I planned to tell him I just moved here and didn't know, but oh boy, he didn't need directions. He was after something entirely different. He smiled at me and said something I didn't catch, comprehend, or understand. So I said, "What?" or "Excuse me?" to get him to repeat it. I got a little closer so I could hear him better, and he said, "Do you want to have sex?" So at that time I didn't know what that meant, except that maybe I kind of did, and knew that it was a bad word. I didn't know what to do, whatever that meant. I turned and ran to my neighbor's house and didn't look back. I was crying and they called my mom and my parents came, and my parents called the police about it. A couple of days later, the police department had a sketch artist come meet my parents and I at the station to work with me. I did the best I could, but honestly, I wasn't studying the man's features or even trying to remember his face at the time of the incident, so I don't know how accurate it actually was. My parents and I thought that was the end of it. Nobody really thought they would find him. The cops were saying things like if they found him, he would go to jail for a while, for his obscene question to me. My mom was nervous that if it came to that, I would have to go to court and testify, and she didn't feel good about putting me through that. She was worried that even as an underdeveloped 10-year-old child, the defense would attempt to shame me in some way, or say I was asking for it. About a week later, I was getting off the bus and I hear a car horn beep. I looked to see it and it was the same guy, same VW Beetle, smiling and waving at me. I was stunned. I blankly waved back for some reason, but at the same time memorized his tag number. I repeated it to myself over and over as I ran to my house to write it down and call Mom. Cops were notified and the guy was identified. He lived 20 minutes away in another town. His local cops knew and were friendly with his family. The good old boy system. So he didn't go to jail, but apparently they told him to stay away from me. I never saw him again and I hope I never do. I wonder how many times he might have followed the bus and watched me that I never even knew about. Dear pedo pervert predator, let's never meet again. This happened last night as I was coming home from work. I'm a 23-year-old woman and I don't have a driver's license, so I take public transport or Uber a lot. I've had several people give me general bad vibes and make me feel unsafe. But this is the first time somebody has crossed the line from creepy to scary with me on my commute. I stayed a little later than usual at work yesterday, because I'm trying to learn After Effects and I wanted to spend a little more time on the practice project I had going. I left the office around 5:45 and walked 10 minutes to the bus stop. The sun was going down, but there was still light in the sky. I didn't have to wait long for the bus. The driver pulled up and was very friendly as she scanned my ticket, which is on my phone. I took one of the seats that faces the inside aisle, which I prefer not to do, but it was the only place to sit where I didn't have to sit directly next to somebody who was already on the bus. Because, I value personal space. After a few stops, we made a stop near the major university in my city. A young guy got on, probably younger than me, but not by much, and sat directly next to me. He smelled awful, but not as bad as some people I've encountered on the bus, so I didn't think to move or anything. Right away he made a sound like, "Ha!" and I thought he was going to comment on the music in my headphones, but he didn't. He looked at my phone. "Are you on Facebook?" "I'm on Twitter." Never understood it. "You ever sold anything on Facebook?" I said no. He kept asking me weird questions like that, like he just wanted to talk to me and he didn't care what it was about. At this point I figured he was trying to flirt and was just bad at it, so I politely answered his questions and tried not to be too friendly about it. He asked if I was a student, which I'm not, and whether I would rather live in a mansion or an apartment. Obviously a mansion, I told him. He said his goal was to have a house big enough to put a skate park in. That's a good goal, I said, thinking that this guy was probably not playing with a full deck, but not wanting to be an asshole about it. He said, "You're awesome." And he asked me, "Are you looking for a best friend?" I said no, that I have a best friend. We've known each other since we were 8 years old. And then, like it was so casual, he said, "And we've known each other since we were 8 years old." And then, like it was so casual, he said, "If you tell me where he lives, I could kill him." I didn't know what to say. I looked around for someone on the bus to intervene, but no one had heard what he said. So I just said, probably not." He laughed. "You smell good." I just put my headphones back on and tried to tune him out. There were no available seats for a couple of stops, so I just had to sit there with him talking in my ear. I couldn't hear him. I was listening to Pedro Fernandez as loud as I could. As soon as the seat opened up, I moved away from him to forward-facing seat and put my purse next to me in a defensive position. I started to get worried about whether this guy would get off the bus before I did. My destination was pretty far down the line, but I didn't need him following me home or even knowing where I usually get off the bus. What would have stopped him from waiting for me? I texted my roommate to pick me up at the Hooters halfway home. Right as I did this, he got off downtown. And lucky for me because my roommate was busy and couldn't pick me up. Also, my childhood best friend is a girl. I wasn't about to tell him that, though. So creepy guy who wants to kill my best friend, take a different bus next time. Back when I was 15, I picked up my younger brother from elementary school every day, and we would bus home together. We had to transfer 2 times, and this happened at the same stop at the second transfer. One day I saw an old Caucasian man get onto the bus after us. He looked around 60 years old with white hair, and he was really large. Since there was no seats available, I stood up to offer my seat to him. He gave me a smile and thanked me. I thought nothing of it. After a few minutes, I noticed that he was still staring at me with a smile, and at that time I thought he was just appreciating the fact that I gave up my seat for him. After another while, I just started to get uncomfortable because I was noticing that maybe he had mental health issues or he was just slow because of his age. I took my brother by the hand and we moved back towards the back of the bus. By the time our stop arrived, the bus was pretty empty. My brother and I exited, and we started walking in the direction of our apartment, which was only a few feet away from the bus stop. I was pretty paranoid from earlier, so I turned around to check if anyone had followed us off the bus. I saw the old man walking in our direction, and I internally panicked. I reasoned to myself that maybe he lived in this area as well, and it was just a coincidence that he was walking in this direction. So I kept walking towards the gate of my apartment. My brother and I got to the gate, and I was digging in my backpack for my keys. Suddenly I felt a tap on my shoulder, and I looked up to see the old man smiling at me. I didn't know how to react, so I just said hello, and kept looking for my keys while I kept my eyes on him. By that time I was really creeped out, because his stare was so intense. He said thanks for giving your seat for me, and asked if I was free to go for lunch with him, so he could really thank me. In my head, all I could think was that it was around 4 o'clock. So why would he want to go to lunch? I quickly declined, shoved my brother past the gate and slammed it behind me. The old man just kept smiling and staring as I looked back. and I was glad that I was able to escape from him. A few days passed and I thought nothing more than the incident. Then one day I saw him again at the bus stop. I tried to stand as far away as possible and tried not to look in that direction. I could feel him staring at me, and I remember just wishing that that bus would come faster so I could get away. We got onto the bus and I could still see him smiling as he stared at me, unblinkingly out of the corner of my eye. I tried to keep my attention on the book that I was reading and not let it bother me. When our stop came, my brother and I quickly got off the bus and sped walked to the gate. I turned around to check if the old man had followed us off the bus and was immensely relieved that he didn't. I looked at the bus as it drove past, and I remember seeing him by the window seat, just staring at me. For the next few weeks, he just kept showing up at the same bus stop. Sometimes I would see him sitting by a ledge, and when he saw us, he would get in line for the bus. Sometimes